sexy guys do. Explore what's soul in their minds. Thinking about a thing or two, about a thing or two, about a thing or two. Mansplaining is deciding you're gonna search for the truth. Mansplain me, baby. Mansplain. There can be no thinking that would be uncool.
Welcome to Mansplaining, a podcast about the interesting things you can discover if you just take the time to learn. My name is Joe. I'm your host for this week. And as always, I'm joined by my college friend Mark. Together, we'll explore what's on our minds and hopefully figure out a thing or two about a thing or two. Mark, our challenge today is to have a cheery conversation about cemeteries.
Nothing puts a smile on my face quite like a cemetery.
Yes, indeed. For the sake of our listeners, let me go back and re-describe why I'm asking this question. So my wife has become quite a good amateur genealogist. And during a recent vacation, we did some genealogical history on her mother's side of the family. And that took us to some old cemeteries where we were able to locate the gravestones of some of her ancestors. And it was really interesting and wonderful success on the genealogy end. But while we were in these cemeteries, and there were 3 or 4 of them that we visited, 2 things were strikingly evident to me. One was that the cemeteries were incredibly well maintained. The grass looked newly mowed. There wasn't a single piece of litter anywhere. It was beautiful green, stretching as far as you can see in every direction. And that was kind of striking to me. And then the second thing was there was nobody there. In the 4 cemeteries we visited, I doubt we saw more than 5 or 10 people total, not in each location, but total. Yeah. And that got my wife and me thinking about the business model of cemeteries. Like, how can anybody afford to pay for all that maintenance and upkeep to keep an empty cemetery looking beautiful? And the fact that nobody's there, I wonder if this is like a dying thing. It seems like many more people get cremated today than get buried, at least in my circles. So I put the question to you, what is the economic model for cemeteries, if any? Who pays for all that upkeep? And as older cemeteries run out of space and more people decide to get cremated, is there even a need or a demand for graveyards anymore? So what did you find?
Well, I found that cemeteries and the mortuary industry as a whole are a very big deal, both financially and culturally, and that's still true today. Mourning the death of a loved one or family member, properly disposing of the remains, and performing rituals designed to show respect to the dead and conduct the soul to the afterlife are practices that have been given tremendous importance throughout human history. And those things are still important today. In 2024, the global mortuary industry, which includes funeral homes and services, was valued at $77.1 billion. There are about 150,000 cemeteries in the U.S. today, give or take. And the industry is still growing. But it has certainly encountered challenges recently, and we'll be going into those in depth. I will not sink to the depth of a pun to say that we'll be going 6 feet under into those issues, but we'll be going into some depth. First, though, as is often the case with the episodes where I am the person bringing the knowledge, it's time for a quick history lesson. And cemeteries do have a very, very long history. The oldest known human burials were found in a cave in Israel and date back 120,000 years. Though it's possible that the practice of burial is even older than that. For instance, there are remains dating back 430,000 years at Cima de los Huesos in Spain, likely belonging to Homo heidelbergensis, which is a slightly different variant on the human chain. While some scholars suggest deliberate placement, there's little evidence of ritual, which implies that this was more a matter of simply disposing of the corpse rather than a full-blown burial as we would understand it today. And here's a fascinating point, or at least fascinating to me. 120,000 years ago is also the approximate date of the earliest Neanderthal burials, though it's not known whether one of these two species, Homo sapiens or Neanderthals, learned the practice from the other, whether it evolved independently within the two species, or whether they had a common ancestor that engaged in burial practices that have not survived in the archaeological record. The first burial headstones, in the form of large megalithic monuments, appeared around 3000 BC in Europe. In the cave of Tafarot in Morocco, which is considered by many archaeologists the oldest known structured cemetery, contains skeletons dating back about 15,000 years. The oldest cemetery in the U.S., meanwhile, is considered to be the Miles Standish Burial Ground in Duxbury, Massachusetts, which was established in 1638 and was the final resting place for many of the pilgrims who came over on the Mayflower. Remarkably, this cemetery is still in use today.
And of course, we often come across cemeteries in unlikely places. Like I'm sure you've had the experience of driving in an old town and looking on the side of the road, and there might be some graves there and not even fenced in. And it was some kind of cemetery from hundreds of years ago that's kind of been lost to history. And I doubt it even counts as one of the 150,000 you mentioned for the overall total.
Yeah. Now, early colonial burials in the U.S. often took place on family land or in churchyards. The 19th century, though, saw the gradual professionalization of funeral services as the cabinet makers who built the coffins began to expand their services, eventually becoming undertakers who coordinated funeral arrangements. Rural cemeteries, such as Mount Auburn Cemetery in Cambridge, Massachusetts, developed as an alternative to overcrowded urban cemeteries, and the huge number of deaths during the Civil War, along with the need to transport the dead back home for burial, led to the widespread adoption of embalming, which played a big role in shaping modern funeral practices. Eventually, funeral homes emerged as dedicated spaces for funeral services and viewings. In the U.S., many cemeteries were historically segregated, which defined not just where people were buried, but how much was invested in maintaining those spaces. White cemeteries often benefited from endowments and city protection, while Black, Indigenous, immigrant, and poor cemeteries were left to decay, erased by highways, or buried under urban development projects. The early 20th century saw further expansion and professionalization of the funeral industry, but the shift towards cremation in the latter part of the century really shook things up. The rise of cremation is partly due to environmental concerns. About 13% of people who choose cremation cite traditional burials over use of wood and steel as a motivation, but it's mostly driven by economic forces. On average, a funeral with viewing and traditional burial in the United States costs around $8,000 to $10,000, which includes the plot, the vault, and various cemetery fees. The burial plot on its own typically costs between $1,200 and $2,000, though it might be as high as $25,000 or even $50,000 in premium urban locations, and some plots in Manhattan cost more than $1 million. At first blush, cremation isn't much cheaper. The median cost for a funeral with cremation was $6,280 in 2023, but most of this cost is for the funeral. The cremation itself generally costs about $2,000, so a family that's willing to ditch the funeral services and just scatter the ashes on their own can save a bunch of money. There are additional alternatives to traditional burial, water cremation, for instance, or human composting, both of which offer more eco-friendly options and are appealing to more environmentally conscious consumers, which are also less expensive than traditional burial. Now, personally, I have some experience with these things. When my father passed a couple years ago, I was the executor of his estate, and cremation was by far the least expensive option that we had at our disposal. I was actually pleasantly surprised at how reasonable the cost actually was. His second wife had predeceased him and had already been cremated, but the ashes hadn't been distributed, so we had them scattered together. Cremation surpassed traditional burials in popularity in the U.S. around 2016 and is expected to account for over 80% of all posthumous arrangements by 2045. There are, however, demographic trends suggesting forces working in the opposite direction, namely the impending silver tsunami of aging baby boomers. The baby boomer generation, which comprises roughly 76 million Americans born between 1946 and 1964, represents the largest demographic cohort in U.S. history. Approximately 10,000 Americans from this generation are turning 65 every day until 2030, setting the stage for a massive death wave projected to peak between 2040 and 2060. And baby boomers historically exhibit a preference for traditional burial, at least compared to younger cohorts. Boomers as a group have also accumulated significant wealth, with estimates suggesting they hold over half of all household wealth in America. This financial standing provides many with the means to opt for more premium and elaborate traditional burial options. In short, the fact that traditional burial is expensive is less of a concern for this rapidly aging cohort. However, in the meantime, and probably the long term, cremation is having a significant effect on the industry. It reduces demand for burial plots, and that poses a real problem for the mortuary industry. Let's take a look at modern cemetery economics. There are three types of cemeteries today. Public, government-run cemeteries are subsidized or maintained by government funds. Examples would include U.S. national veteran cemeteries, which offer services free of charge. Religious and nonprofit cemeteries operate on a not-for-profit basis, funded in part by endowment funds or church budgets. Examples here would be Catholic cemeteries, but there are also cemeteries associated with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, otherwise known as Mormons, Muslim cemeteries, Buddhist cemeteries, Hindu cemeteries, and so on. For-profit cemeteries are in the majority, though, and they operate as businesses. The fundamental revenue stream for a for-profit cemetery comes from the initial sale of burial plots, cremation niches, crypts, and mausoleum spaces. Cemeteries typically sell burial rights and retain responsibility for long-term maintenance.
Okay, so they charge for the plots. That makes sense. But cemeteries, it seems to me, must have very high fixed costs, right? The security, the mowing, the cleaning, the grave digging, making sure the fences are well maintained, etc. And who's paying for that?
Well, wait about 30 seconds and I'll tell you, because that is coming up shortly. So in addition to the initial sale, cemeteries also make money by charging opening and closing fees for graves to cover the labor and equipment for preparing and refilling the plot at the time of burial. And on top of this, they will also sell and or install headstones, markers, monuments, and plaques for niches. Most of the money comes from plot sales, though, and this is a dwindling income stream. The rise of cremation has led to a 90% reduction in annual grave plot sales in some cemeteries. Service Corporation International, the largest provider of funeral, cremation, and cemetery services in North America, with more than 1,500 funeral homes and 400 cemeteries across the U.S., Canada, and Puerto Rico, reports that it loses $10 million for every 1% shift to cremation. And then there's the other part, which you just brought up, which is that cemeteries are responsible for the long-term care of the grounds, including landscaping, road repairs, and record keeping. The industry handles this with a perpetual care trust, which is a legally mandated portion of every plot sale, often 5% to 25%, that is deposited into an irrevocable fund, and only the interest or dividends generated by these funds are used to cover ongoing maintenance. A significant challenge for the industry is that many historical funds, especially those established in the 60s and 70s, are proving inadequate to cover current maintenance costs due to lower investment returns and escalating operational expenses. These funds were established assuming 7 or 8% annual returns, but lately they've been earning 2 to 4%. A plot that sold for $2,000 in 1970, with 10% going to perpetual care, needs to generate enough interest to cover maintenance costs that have risen from approximately $50 a year in 1970 to over $200 today. Both California and Florida have had to intervene in failing cemetery funds, And obviously, this scenario calls into question cemeteries' ability to deliver on the promise that your loved one would have a permanent home in the family plot. Cemeteries have adapted to this by revising their rules so they can dig deeper into the trust funds to cover expenses, but this might prove a short-term solution that carries an even greater long-term cost. And cemeteries are making a big push into pre-need sales, getting people to buy plots before anyone has died. And while this might provide some much-needed cash in the short term, it doesn't expand the market. You're just getting the money out a few years early.
My mother did that, by the way.
The pre-need plot?
Yes. Attention mansplaining listeners. If you want to engage with Mark and me, you have some options. One is to go to our Facebook page, Mansplaining the Podcast, where you can leave a comment or question, check our sources, suggest topics for future episodes, or just like us. Because who doesn't want to be liked? You can also reach us through whatever app you use to listen to this podcast by giving us a 5-star rating or writing a review of your favorite episode. Or you can call and leave us a message on our dedicated voicemail box, which is 206-486-4074. And did you know that you can now listen to full episodes of Mansplaining on YouTube and check out our podcast music on Spotify? Yep, it's true. Just type Mansplaining Podcast into the search bar on either platform and you'll find us. It's lonely in podcast land, and we welcome and appreciate any feedback you might want to share. Act now, and we'll throw in a set of Ginsu knives. Not really.
The larger operations are attempting to streamline costs by consolidating. Service Corporation International and other major players are acquiring struggling independent cemeteries to capitalize on economies of scale. For instance, a single centralized crematory can serve multiple funeral homes, and bulk purchasing of caskets and urns allows for better vendor pricing. Consolidation also opens up cross-selling opportunities where funeral homes and cemeteries can operate as a package deal. These companies are hoping that a diversified portfolio and greater financial resources will allow them to invest in new technologies and adapt to evolving consumer preferences. Additionally, cemeteries, both large and small, are diversifying. For instance, many cemeteries are running out of space. This is not a new problem. Cemeteries and burial plots have been running out of space for centuries. All these years after grad school, I still remember reading about a modern Greek rural custom in which burial comes in 2 stages. First, the body is buried, and then some months later, the bones are dug back up, stripped of any remaining scraps of flesh, and transferred to a communal bone depository. Modern European cemeteries operate in a somewhat similar fashion, with grave sites leased rather than sold, and the leases usually cover 10 to 25 years. This allows sites to be recycled over and over again. In the U.S., however, burial rights are usually sold in perpetuity, and so cemeteries are investing in vertical alternatives to burial plots like mausoleums and columbaria, which are structures for cremation urns or niches. Brazil's Memorial Necropole Ecumenica provides the most extreme example. It's a 32-story vertical cemetery that looks like a cross between an office building and a self-storage facility. This may be the cemetery of the future, not a grassy tree-lined space, but a skyscraper. Or maybe the opposite. Jerusalem has an underground burial complex that goes 22 floors straight down. Some cemeteries are offering ancillary services, such as on-site crematories, chapel rentals, genealogical research, and merchandise sales. Personally, I've never seen a gift shop at a cemetery, but I can imagine you might head in there for flowers or balloons to leave at a family member's headstone. Other cemeteries are offering event hosting, leveraging their scenic grounds for cultural events. The Hollywood Forever Cemetery, for instance, hosts concerts and outdoor movie nights. I went to the website hoping that they would lean into the venue by showing scary movies, and I was not disappointed. Next month, they'll be showing Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The Oakland Cemetery, meanwhile, has swung in the opposite direction, offering wedding packages for brides and grooms-to-be who don't think it might be a bad omen to get married while surrounded by the dead. And then there are extras, QR codes on headstones, for instance, or digital memorials that play a video highlighting this deceased life. It's easy to poke fun at some of these innovations, but so far at least they appear to be working. The U.S. cemetery service market was valued at $6.4 billion in 2024 and is projected for steady growth. And the broader death care industry, including cremation services and diversified offerings, has seen modest profit margin growth from 8.8% in 2019 to 11.1% in 2024.
I was curious about repurposing cemeteries for public use. It's interesting to me that cemeteries are not only getting more vertical, but they're being used for things like movies. I've also heard about art installations on cemetery grounds because they're so beautiful and scenic. I want to mention Greenwood Cemetery in Brooklyn, which is probably the most famous cemetery in New York City. It's a tourist site. Not only because it's beautiful, but because a lot of famous people are buried there. Leonard Bernstein is there, and many other famous people. I won't bore you with the list. But the interesting thing about Greenwood is it's free to enter. And so I wonder whether simply charging an admission fee, is that something that occurred to anyone? So if you're going to run a movie there or have an art installation, or you take advantage of your famous grounds or scenic grounds for picnics or for people to gawk over, maybe you should charge admission.
Yeah, there's certainly a strong parallel to that in Europe, where if you're going to a historical site that has the burial site of a king, that sort of thing, you will see at least a suggested donation earned as you go in. So you can think of the modern cemetery as kind of like a library that historically was focused on preserving physical books. But with the digital revolution, fewer people are checking out those books. Instead of closing, this hypothetical library is digitizing its archives, building high-tech media centers, hosting community events and workshops, offering audiobooks alongside print and digital books, and even selling coffee and merchandise to fund its mission of preserving stories and serving the public. There's no doubt that traditional cemeteries, taking up a lot of space with long rows of headstones, are under challenge. The economics of that old model don't really work anymore. The baby boomer death surge will undoubtedly provide a significant revenue boost to the death care industry in the coming decades, especially between 2040 and 2060. This influx of deaths will likely provide a financial cushion for large operators like SCI. However, once the peak of the boomer death wave passes and subsequent generations with their even higher cremation preferences become the primary clientele, traditional burial revenues will likely see a sharp decline. This points to a strong likelihood of continued and potentially accelerated cemetery closures in the 2050 to 2070 timeframe, particularly for independent cemeteries that haven't diversified their services or been acquired by larger conglomerates. That being said, there is no sign that humans are becoming any less sentimental about death, and there will always be a market for the industry that helps shape death into something more comforting and manageable. My family went rogue. We paid for the cremation and then took care of the rest on our own. But many other families will want a permanent resting place where they can gather, grieve, and remember. The only question is what that cemetery of the future will be. A plot of land, a multi-story office building, a multimedia experience, or something we haven't seen yet. Time will tell.
Interesting. And I note your last point about potential last hurrah for cemeteries being to accommodate the death of all the baby boomers, because as we discussed ourselves in a prior episode of Mansplaining, the birth rate ain't keeping up. So there's probably going to be a demographic cliff ahead for the mortuary industry. So they better take in their profits while they can and figure out something different to do with their space, right, after that.
Right. And a note to our listeners, if your 401k portfolio includes a large investment in cemetery conglomerates like SCI, try to get out of that by 2060 because the good times will be over.
You hear that, people? Sell. Mansplaining is even good for stock tips occasionally. So one thing you didn't talk about is whether there are any new cemeteries being built, because that's another thing I was wondering.
Everything that I've read suggests that if you think of a cemetery as a broad grassy plain with lots of room for headstones, probably not a whole lot, at least not within urban areas where it's just so expensive. I think if there is something new, it's going to be like those facilities in Brazil and Jerusalem, where it's a structure that either goes straight up or straight down, and your burial plot will be on somewhere on the 13th floor. And maybe that can be the new funeral arrangement that's built out for the future, is something which is more of an urban experience and follows the urban plan of the metal and glass building reaching to the sky.
Right. Well, I mean, I guess there's two ways of thinking about that. One is that if you have an industry that has no new inventory, no new cemeteries coming online, that's a dying industry by definition. On the other hand, given all the retrofitting and digitizing that you mentioned, cemeteries can completely transform themselves into something different, something modern and appealing. And then maybe if they're successful at that, maybe you don't need any new inventory after all.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I wanted to mention something about my family as an illustration of another possible reason for the decline of cemeteries. And it is that it used to be that people lived near each other for all their time. Families stayed together and didn't drift away from each other. But now maybe family plots are passé because families don't live near each other anymore. For example, my family all comes from New Jersey, but not a single one of us lives in New Jersey anymore. And there is a family plot for my family in the cemetery in Jersey City, which is the next town over to Bayonne, New Jersey, where I grew up. And I don't think anyone in my nuclear family has visited that cemetery in decades, even though we have some relatives there. And we're certainly not going to be buried there if indeed we're buried when we die. So I wonder whether you think there's some valence to that point, that cemeteries decline because the ethos of a cemetery was a place where families can be together forever. And that just simply doesn't exist anymore.
I think there's definitely something to that. I'm thinking back to how it felt to go back to my hometown and visit the house I grew up in decades after I'd left. And my sisters were all in different places, and we would come like once a year, usually at Christmas, to come back and visit. And there was still that feeling of sort of, I don't want to compare it to Mecca because that's facile, but sort of that idea of returning to your roots and going back to this primal space. I could see a family plot still having symbolic value for people, a family that's more dispersed like that. But yes, in terms of it being a place where once a week you go by to rake the leaves and refresh the flowers and to kind of have a relationship with that imagined person who's still resident there in the burial plot, I do see that as probably one that's watered down as people disperse, and maybe that makes it less desirable.
Yeah, I agree. Both of these things could be true at the same time. So, yeah. Well, thank you. That's an interesting answer. And I'm a little surprised to hear that cemeteries are not drawing their last breath right now. And actually, there might be some future for the mortuary industry. That's a little surprising to me.
As long as death is something that's meaningful for us, people will find ways to make money in managing the death, in regularizing, ritualizing, and helping us navigate death. And so there'll always be money to be made there until we reach the point where we think that dying is no big deal. And I don't see that happening anytime soon.
And if there is a cemetery near me having a screening of Night of the Living Dead, I am so there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So you ready for the question for next time?
I am, yes.
So I have a memory from college that has stuck with me all these years. One of the books we were reading was Jean-Jacques Rousseau's Social Contract, in which he argues that democracy is only truly feasible in small states or communities where the community members have shared interests and a common outlook. So I'd like to take that argument up again. What would Rousseau have to say about our current situation in the United States? And do you, Joe, agree with him?
Oh boy, that's a loaded question. But those are often my favorite type of questions to talk about. So I will look into that and have something hopefully intelligent to say about it in a couple of weeks.
Okay, I look forward to it.
And until then, that was Mark, and I'm Joe, and we'll talk to you next time.
See you then.
I used to take the evening ferry, hosted parties that were merry. My wine of choice was elderberry. Now I'm in the cemetery. Very scary. I should be eating Swiss chard, enjoying plays by the bard, or 8-point guard. Instead I'm buried in a graveyard, and it's hard. You see, I'm dead. My cheeks no longer red. Nothing left to be said. I wish I could say it was still me. And by the way, did you kill me? It was a hell of a run, I must say, but for all my seize the day, I'm feeling some dismay, 'cause there are maggots where I lay. I'm all alone in this pine box, under an immaculate lawn, just a biodegradable husk with a mask of eau de Cologne. Every day from dusk to dawn, that's 'cause I'm dead. My cheeks no longer red. Nothing left of my head, just to make sure I'm not breathing, or I'll really be seething. That's D-A-D.
Mansplaining is brought to you by Joe and Mark and nobody else. Music composed and performed by the Mansplaining House Band. Thank you for spending your time with us, and we'll see you next time.